Hello and welcome to the Darkside. I'm your host, Tabitha Purple, and TC Storm will be joining us later. Hopefully, you're able to comment. So, this is the show where we discuss, discover, educate, and have some time to look into different subject areas. Today's subject is a hot topic. We've covered it in small parts over the years, but we are looking at the over-policing of Black children, and it comes out of a report that was recently released out of the UN. So hold on to your seats. But for now, we always start with our big news stories that we observed this week. And so this week's news story goes to British Gas in the UK from my story. I'm sure Mr. Storm will tell you something else. So what has happened is that British Gas have just announced that they will have profits 8 times their usual rate. So they've got eightfold increase in their profit, puts them to having about £1 billion in cash, which is in their balance sheet, which is a lot because generally, like big companies will have their assets and things tied up in other resources, but they have £1 billion in cash. The pre-tax profits that they're generating, that they believe to be eightfold in 2022, will be eightfold, 761 million. So this is a astronomical amount of money that they're thinking of making. And why are they making such much money? Because, of course, the Ukraine's war effect on wholesale gas prices has prompted them to have more profit. So what's the story that comes off the back of this, you might ask? Well, the Times did an investigative piece in the UK, the Times newspaper. Do they still call them newspapers? The Times journalistic? I don't know what you would call them now. Anyway, the Times newspaper is what I remember it at. But the Times did a journalistic investigation into British Gas because they drew some attention to some stories in which British Gas were using a bailiff company, which was breaking into people's houses and replacing their regular meter with a prepay meter. And so prepay meters, if you don't live in the UK, basically mean you have to top up the meter with actual physical money every time in order to get access to your gas. So you can imagine you're going from a system where you would pay a monthly bill and you receive gas to having that taken away, and you actually have to go to a physical point and pay physical money to top up. Why is this a bad thing? Well, it's a bad thing because prepay meters don't allow you to have any credit. So you can't use some gas and then obviously pay it off as time goes over. They also charge one of the highest rates for gas is on a prepaid meter. It's like literally the most expensive way. So it's meant to be a way to stop debt accumulating. It's meant to be a way that is for poorer people to access gas and electricity in the UK. But what actually ends up happening is it's one of the highest rates of prices that you will pay for gas and electric. So what British Gas did was employ a company that was breaking into people's houses, literally physically breaking in. They document a number of stories and were taking delight in breaking into these people's houses with the locksmith, replacing their meter, and then the person would come home to new locks and demeter and traumatized because, of course, your house has been broken into for the sole purposes of putting you onto this gas meter. And once you're onto a prepaid meter, it is one of the most difficult things to come off of. They don't just switch them over just like that. So it is effectively cycling people into higher costs of living and debt, etc. This was not the end of the piece. Off the back of that, another journalistic endeavor went in to actually find out that what they were also using on the other side was a debt collect agency for dead people. So if you died and you owed British Gas any money, they would use a debt collection agency to seek that money from your estate or from your family. And so they were doing both things. Now, the company themselves have said they are horrified. This is not the kind of company that they are. They don't do this sort of behavior. This isn't, this isn't what they represent. And yes, if you see the lovely glossy adverts, that might be true. But the truth is, that is exactly what you represent when you hire people who are breaking into people's homes to replace their meter with a prepaid meter and put them onto one of the highest prices of gas that you could possibly have. So I don't know if Mr. Storm has anything to add to that, other than disgusting company with really bad ethics and should not exist, probably.
This is exactly who British Gas are. There have been stories about them doing things like this popping up over the years. So, to say you're horrified by this when this is actually your policies being put into practice is laughable. But here's the thing that I would ask. Were you so horrified by these practices that actually you undid this? That you took out the prepaid meters that you put in?
Nope, nope,
No?
nope, nope,
Then you weren't horrified by it.
nope. What
You
they
were just
actually
upset
did
you got caught.
was just stop using the company that were doing the activity. They'll
Of
just
course.
find a new company to do the activity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
So,
what was it? You were saying the same thing about this. You were saying something about the fact that they only did that because Ofgem got involved.
yeah. Look, if the regulatory bodies didn't get involved, it would have been business as usual.
Mm.
And it is still very much going to be business as usual. And I think part of the problem is that regulatory bodies don't have the power to do anything really besides fine a company.
Mm.
And when a company gets fined, that's okay. They absorb that with the profits that they've made and then recoup it the next year by hiking up prices. And so for me, I think we need to look really at overhauling the whole industry and how companies are regulated. Um, and if that means then that you impose, you change legislation to impose the fact that they can't increase prices for X amount of years, well, that will
Mm-hmm.
hit shareholders in the pocket. And then the shareholders will ensure that things are done properly, because
Yeah,
once the shareholders aren't making money,
yeah.
hey, people at the top heads will be rolling. So if you really want to have accountability and change, you need to change the powers that the regulatory bodies have at their disposal.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And with the shareholders receiving £59 million in payouts last year alone, and they have a buyback system which they can get 250 per share, £250. That's a lot of power that they have to make change. Hurt the
Yeah,
shareholders, you will certainly get a change out of the business.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's that, or my preferred method is actually just to renationalize all of this.
Well, these problems didn't occur under the nationalised system, so unsurprisingly. So yes, the fact that it's been deregulated and gone to this sort of system has definitely, it's definitely a moment to think about the difficulties that there are. What is your news story for today, Mr. Storm? Do you have one for us?
Well, actually, I cheekily managed to get two in.
Is this a two
Because
for the
what I
price of
want to
one?
talk about is actually the protests that have been taking place in Israel for the past few weeks.
Okay.
And it's something that really hasn't made it into mainstream news. And you have to
It's been
ask
all over
yourself
my
why.
news. Oh, has
Hmm?
it not?
No.
Oh, really? I've had it
The
all
fact,
over my newsfeed. Is
the
that just
fact
me
that
because of what I'm signed up to?
maybe, but the fact that for the past 5 weeks, people have been
Mm,
taken to the streets in their thousands across Israel to
mm.
protest the new government and their policies and plans. And one, I think it's important to note when they're doing it, the timing of their protests, and that their protests occur immediately after Sabbath ends, I think is a statement, right? Um, but the reason I am going to get two stories in because I think they're very closely linked. So in Australia, um, there's a real argument going on right now because within academia because they're trying to get universities to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism.
Okay.
And this definition makes it criticism of the state of Israel, by definition, anti-Semitic. So I want you to realize what's happening here, right? The Israelis who are protesting their government for the past 5 weeks in Israel, by definition, will be anti-Semitic.
Oh, but Israel is a country, yeah, with a government that you should be freely able to criticize for their often illegal actions, as it has been said on the world stage. What has that got to do with anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism, the hatred of the people because of their religious or national racial identity, two separate issues. Two very separate issues. And we've discussed this before on the dark side. We have put this forward on the dark side when we're looking at Palestine and the treatment of the Palestinian people. But this really, it makes me feel really sick that we're back at this stage again with this agenda to push this thing that Israel is basically the country, the state is above a conversation or being held accountable for their actions. You can't bomb people, shoot people, or in the case of raiding people and killing people, is what they've been doing over the last few weeks I've had on my newsfeed. You can't do that and then just be like, but you're anti-Semitic if you tell us. What is that?
Well, as I said, just think about it. The very Israeli, the very Jews who are living in Israel, who are currently on the streets by the thousands protesting the policies of their current government, would by definition be anti-Semitic in their criticism of their own government and country. Make that make sense?
Well, it doesn't, but that is a genuine manipulation of a global conversation. That's what that is. That's a genuine move to manipulate political and global conversations to hold you accountable for your behavior. Because what you can always do is cry anti-Semitism and then just fall on the floor. And of course, everyone will balk at that. What you're not dealing with is the fact that your behavior is incorrect, is wrong and immoral and illegal, and you should stop invading other people's lands, places, and ruining their houses and destroying their properties. You should just stop.
Listen, I think it's time that people around the world have a real conversation about the state of Israel, and not whether it should exist or not. But I think we need to have a conversation about whether it should be treated as a pariah state. And I say this because of its historical and current stance towards things. So here's the thing. One little known fact is that they were massive supporters of apartheid South Africa. Right? They were willing and had entered into deals to trade arms with South Africa under apartheid when it was under a trade embargo, international arms trade embargo, because of apartheid. They had secretly agreed and offered and agreed to sell nuclear weapons to South Africa whilst it was under apartheid embargo, and that was in violation of a treaty against nuclear arms testing or something like that at the time. Okay, So when we're talking about their policies and their stance, we can historically see, right? And initially, this is the thing. Initially, Israel as a nation was opposed to South Africa. But the reason for this was because so many Nazis had fled there, right? But what happened was when they saw that actually the state of their nations in regards to apartheid were so similar, they began to form closer and stronger ties with South Africa, right? To the point where what we're looking at in regards to Palestine, we're talking, let's see, 30 something years ago, we managed to get rid of apartheid in South Africa. South Africa was declared to be a pariah state by many nations across the world. So my question would be, considering that the Palestinians are living in the same conditions, right? Considering that the Palestinians don't have access to what will be considered human rights and human necessities, the question then becomes, why hasn't this happened? Now, I can offer some suggestions for that, but that's probably another show in and of itself. But I think we need to start having the question of, if 30 years ago we could say that these behaviors were unacceptable, why are we then still tolerating them today?
Yeah, okay. That's a lot to ponder. I guess that will drive our viewers and listeners to have a look and see for themselves what is happening. Unfortunately, the picture is not pretty. As I said, for me, the timeline has been filled with news out of Israel, but actually more over the slaughtering of people than the actual protests, as you're speaking of, to the actual government. But yeah, it's not good.
Well, here's the thing. You'll get the stories about the slaughter of people, right? But I think it's important that the image that comes out is that there's a lot of people in Israel that are opposed
Unhappy, yeah,
to
with their own
this,
governments. Yeah.
right? And I think it's important that people understand that this is the picture of Israel. Because I think if you only see the slaughter of Palestinians, right? And there's a silence from the people of Israel, then it's easy to foster anti-Semitism.
Yes. Yes.
Right? So for me, it's important that in this conversation and dialogue, you hear the dissent from the people.
Yes. Yes.
Right? Because I think once you understand that actually the people are opposed to what's happening, and they're opposed to the proposed expansion of settlements and things like this, then it becomes harder for those that wish to foster anti-Semitism to do so.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I 100% agree. I think you've hit the nail on the head. Having been to Israel myself for work study, I can say that the picture on the ground looks very different to the media story. The media story would have you believe that Israelis support Israel's behavior, the state's behavior in the settlement issues and some of the slaughtering of Palestinians. And the truth is far more nuanced and far more difficult for most people that live, work, and breathe in Israel itself. They don't have the same response, and the tensions run very high. And I think that is important to say, because I think it does bring as you say, a more nuanced conversation. It can eliminate some of the anti-Semitic language, behavior that is not to be tolerated, and thereby leading to more unity within people who stand for trying to get justice for marginalized people across the globe. So it's an important issue. Thank you very much. 2 for 1. Cheeky, but well done. Alrighty, so let's get to our main topic for this evening. The main topic is the over-policing of Black children. There was a recent UN report released in January. I'm looking at the copy from the Guardian newspaper, but there are other news sources and the report itself that you can access. And basically, the UN send a working group of experts on people of African descent into different countries to look at how those countries are best serving the racial dynamics within European countries for people of diverse backgrounds. And this one, they visited in 2012 and were back in 2022, so 10 years difference. What you're always hoping to see in a report, that there is a move or progress forwards. In this case, the experts have warned that since the 2012 visit, the country has transformed dramatically with austerity measures, Brexit, and the coronavirus pandemic. But the rights of people of African descent or Black people, depending on your particular penchant, is actually worse than ever. And so they look particularly at young people. They say there is no safe space for young people. So they held a public meeting in the BBC where in Salford, which is up north, and they concluded that Black children or children of African descent were over-policed in their homes, schools, and wider communities. The law is in conflict with the children of African descent. Instead of the children being in conflict with it, they are not breaking the law is breaking their children, was the conclusion of the day's works that they were doing there. The 10-day mission looked to and spoke to different governments, local authorities, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, different academics, lawyers, and members of grassroots organizations. So it's a very wide range that they actually do. Although it's a 10-day visit, it is literally an investigation into this. And so they pack in quite a lot. And I wanted to cover this topic because it touches a few topics that we've covered before, like the Child Q case and others where we've looked at this. So I want to look at some of the statistics. Now, I didn't get the statistics from the report itself, so I had to go and have a quick look for that. So it says that now, today, in the UK, more than half of the Black children are now growing up in poverty. Black children are also twice as likely to be growing up in poverty as poor children, growing up as poor white children, according to new research out. So relative low income is defined at being 60% below the median or the average for the definition of poverty. And so what you're looking at is, over the last decade, the total number of Black children in poor houses has more than doubled, although that increase is partly explained by overall increases. Actually, it's disproportionate to their number in the population. So the proportion of Black children living in poverty went up from 42% to 53% in just under 10 years. It's and this is to say that they go on looking at, although there is a bigger number of white children, respectively to the proportion that they are in society, if you are Black and you're born, you are twice as likely to fall into a poor background. So I want to give you some other statistics, so bear with me when I get those out, because I had to use some different apps to do that. So I'm just going to have a quick look through what I want to give you today. Oh, come on, quicker. So I did the poverty ones. All right, some main facts about children in care. So there were 80,000 children that are in some form of looked after care in 1 year. Okay, those numbers are increasing, but the number of looked after children who are adopted went actually down. So let's have a look at the statistics for white children. versus black children. So white children were less likely to be looked after at 74%, but when they are in looked after situations, they are more likely to be adopted at 83%. This is compared with their share of the population. It's comparative, so they are 79% of the overall population. So the statistics bears weight with that. However, the disproportionate number of black children that are looked after were less likely, so they're 2%, to get adopted. So when you compare that with their share of the population, you're talking about really difficult statistics. And the same is true for Asian children as well. And so what's happening is black children are more likely to be taken into care than their white counterparts. But when they get into care, they're less likely to be adopted out of care. And so there is an over-policing of the home environment in the first place, which will remove a black child quickly from a home, as opposed to a white child in a similar situation and counterpart, that the kind of counterpart that they are. And what then happens is once they are in the system, they are less likely to be adopted out of the system again. And so therefore they're ending up in their formative years being over-policed in this way. Another study looked at the experience that black children have in schools, and the study was conducted actually by the Labour Party, which I found quite interesting. But it says that 95% of young black British people have witnessed racist language in education. More than half of males said they hear racist language in school all the time. Teacher perceptions are seen as the biggest barrier to educational success. 2/3 say they do not trust the police to fairly act towards them, and they think that tackling structural racism is a major issue. So what you're looking at is, so at home, if there is a situation that occurs, they're not in a safe environment because they are more likely to be removed. So if they need support, if they need help, if they fall on hard times, if there's poverty occurring in the house, if they get reported for any reason, they're twice as likely to be taken out of the home. If they manage to stay in their home, so they're in the 50% that stays in the home, then when they get to a school environment, they're experiencing, 95% of them are experiencing racism on a daily basis. If you think this is a British problem, which I found quite interesting, you've got some statistics around the world which says that in the US, when compared and looked at, they report that they are experiencing on average, 5 racial incidents a day. Meanwhile, in Australia, 40% of pupils from non-Anglo or European backgrounds in years 5 to 9 are saying that they are experiencing racial discrimination by their peers, and 20% of pupils from an Aboriginal or Torres Strait background said that they had experienced racial discrimination from their teachers. So that's a report out of Australia. Over in Europe, we're not immune to this, of course. It says in Austrian governments, there was a study done recently, and of course we can only talk about the places where the studies are done. Some places they don't do the study, so we can't tell you those statistics, which lets you know some of those conversations. But in Austrian governments had a study that they done, and it says that 2/3 of school children from a migrant background were failing to reach their expected reading level despite being capable of reading. So you're learning that this, and they then go on to say that there are cultural biases and systemic racism within the Austrian system, which are limiting migrant children from learning proper German. And so those are studies that are done within the individual countries, and we're obviously giving you the highlights. So, we're talking about the UK, but this is an issue that could be global. When we then talk about the mental health of young people, there are some basic facts. 70% of children surveyed who experience racism, and this is now taken from the Centre for Mental Health in the UK, who experience racism in school. It stated that the experience has impacted their well-being. 1 in 5 students who with an identified social, emotional, or mental health disorder are excluded from school. Young people from racialized groups are disproportionately exposed to many known risk factors linked with mental health problems, and these include being excluded from school, being in care, being involved in the criminal justice system, or being homeless. And so to speak to that, the young people in the youth justice system are 3 times more likely to have mental health problems. And children from the poorest 20% of households are 4 times as likely to be suffering with mental health issues. So you can see how these different areas are now crossing over to make it so that children who are in the lowest and poorest are actually experiencing some of the most difficult situations, but are also then being policed in different ways. So if you're experiencing mental health issues, if you're 4 times more, if you're in the poor background, and you're 4 times more likely to be experiencing mental health issues, but that means that you're more likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system, since 40% of young people in the criminal justice system are suffering with the mental health issues. You can see that there is a pipeline and a direct connection to how we are policing our children, and then this ends up within literally a police system. So it says that between March and May 2020, the National Police Chiefs Council found that police were twice as likely to fine young Black, Asian, and minority ethnic men, so that's men aged between 18 to 24, for breaching lockdown regulations than white men of the same age. So when you have a like-for-like comparison, you were twice as likely to receive that fine as if you were from a minority ethnic background, or Black or Asian. There were some other statistics I wanted to give you on this. So, Black children are 10 times more likely to be referred to children and young people's mental health service via social services rather than the GP. So I want to pause here for a minute and help you to understand what this means in a British context. So in a British context, the social services are not... they're not seen as your friend. Let me put it like that. They are more the heavy-handed. I don't know if Mr. Storm has a way of describing this, but they are much more there to police how parents, families are coping as a family unit. And so you can report people to social services, for social services will then step in. They are the ones who will take children away, put them into homes, make recommendations, have them supported or excluded from school. Like they've got a lot of power, social services. Is there a way you would explain that to someone who's not from the UK? Oh, you're on mute.
Better? Right. Social services are the British equivalent of a secret police.
Sad to
Because
say.
they will be trying to get your children to snitch on you for the most mundane things.
Yes.
And some of the things that they will do and some of the things they will believe are incredulous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, there are social workers out there, and I'm speaking on this because I know of this case personally, in which a social worker turned around and said to some parents, "But children don't lie."
Yeah, so I've got friends who are social workers a long time, and I know that they've given their life and soul to making the well-being of children true, but that is not true of social workers generally, and social work as a department, social services as a department. And as Jeremy says, they are incredulous. There are a number of reports over time which look at some really high-profile cases in the UK of where they have failed children, and children have died as a result of their ineptitude. What is frightening is that those children could have been easily saved, and those reports go on to prove that, and there are a number of names that I can't, or at the tip of my tongue, but I can't get them, which you can look up online. The reverse is that is also true, in which children are taken into social services care unnecessarily for, as you say, children don't lie. So what he's saying must be true. Children lie all the time. What are you talking about? Stop your mess. So social services. So what's the big problem with social services referring you for mental health treatment and your GP? Well, if your GP, your general practitioner, your local doctor is not the person referring you, you are coming through at almost a police state system. So it's a way of, you know, instead of it being in your well-being, in your medical care, it's being done by the state in a different department, which often is looking at taking you away from your home, so on and so forth. And so I think
it's a punitive system.
Punitive, thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you very much. It's frightening. I mean, there's another statistic I could give, and then I'll wrap it up here, which is that 27% of young Black people were unemployed as compared to their white counterparts, which is only at 10%. So what you're looking at is this real disparity, real policing, over policing of Black children. They make up a smaller percentage of the population, but on all statistics make up a higher proportion of the number of people within any system that would be there normally to only deal with the fringe elements, you know, criminal elements, a very small minority of any community, but they're making up such a large proportion. And the reason for that is fundamentally, we can look at the adultification of Black children. So there was a report last year that was done, and it said that Black children are more likely to face tougher punishments at school because they are viewed as being more grown up and adult-like. That was a study done by a group called the Commission of Young Lives in England, which says that Black children are treated differently to other children of the same age. This can lead to Black children being disciplined more harshly, including being more likely to be excluded from school. And on that note of being excluded, I think it's something like 4 times more likely to be excluded than your white counterpart. That was the last one I looked at. The Commission said it's very real. Adultification of Black children is a very serious issue. It's a very real issue, and it has a huge impact on the lives of children. Essentially, it's young people being viewed as older. That means that we look after them slightly less, and they don't get the protections and safeguards that they should. This issue, I think, needs to be discussed everywhere as much as possible, because it is scary and it's frightening to think that what is happening is you can have a 10-year-old, and the statistics show us that generally people age children up between 2 to 4 years. And so if you're looking at a 10-year-old child, they're being viewed through the lens of being 14. Well, 14 is a vast difference than 10. But if you're 14 and you're being viewed as an 18-year-old, you're being viewed as an adult when you are still, in fact, a minor, still a child, still behaving like an adolescent, but your peers are being treated that way, and you are not afforded the same grace or the same room to make mistakes, etc. So yeah, that's my introduction to the subject, Mr. Storm. I think I've covered quite a bit, but I just wanted to really highlight this issue and educate people if they hadn't considered it. I know that we have discussed this quite a lot as a family. We've talked about the adultification of children. I think we've talked about it on this channel. We've talked about how our own children have received that treatment, how we know that other people in our communities, in our families and friends have received that treatment. We can talk about children, very famous cases in the States of children who were shot, killed for doing child things, but because they were perceived as an adult, they lost their life as a result. We you know, it's a subject that I think really we need to bring attention to, because I think it needs to be examined. Why, when you hear a child is 10, do you justify it by saying, well, they look like an adult? And I think we've talked about this as it pertains also to the gender disparity, which I haven't really touched on here. but there is such a gender disparity when it comes to Black women and Black girls and Black boys, and how that plays out with gender, where boys are seen as aggressors and adult enough to be beaten and blah, blah, blah. But then that means that girls are always seen as the predator. She's hypersexual. She look at her body, and not treating a child as a child. And that has real lasting consequences on their behavior, and how they actually perceive the world. And again, some of these mental health statistics come into play.
Right. So you've mentioned the adultification of Black children. So there's a paper written by Akwesi Owosu Bempa, out of the University of Toronto, I think it is. And what he talks about actually is the dehumanization of Black people in regards to the police and interactions with the police. And he calls out sociologists for he calls out sociologists for highlighting the discrepancies in representation of Black people within the criminal justice system, but he says that they very rarely look at the underlying reasons for why this occurs. And in it, he cites a paper, which I think is very interesting and perhaps very telling globally. And what it is that he says that social psychological research demonstrates subconscious mental associations between race and crime, and suggests that police officers hold more racially biased and xenophobic attitudes than members of the general public. Right? So I want you to ruminate on this for a minute. Think on it. What he's essentially saying is that the police force is going to hold more racist attitudes than the general public. So that means we're left with a few, well, actually, no, because some of these things can be simultaneously true. That is that your vetting process is woefully inadequate, or that racists are actively seeking to go into policing.
And both of those can be true at the same time.
Right?
Doesn't have to be either or.
So when you're looking at these discrepancies in representation, well, actually, there's a great starting point for us to look at. If the research is showing that police officers, on average, hold more racist and xenophobic attitudes towards Black people and minorities, or world majority peoples, then we need to reform that whole hiring process, that whole vetting process. Right? That's based on the assumption that, it's going to be a problem with vetting. But the other possibility that racists are actually actively seeking police and law enforcement as an occupation should lead us to question, why would someone do this?
It's not once again, with good intentions.
When you start looking at the disproportionate numbers of people of color who are killed at the hands of the police, and the fact that so many get away with impunity, after they have murdered someone should tell you, actually, this is a way for them to play out their deepest fantasies and desires without repercussion.
Yep.
Right? So the statistics on Black children and youth trusting the police in the UK, it's at, I believe it was 38% or 33% of Black youth and children felt that they could trust the police.
Yeah.
Right?
It's about
And it
70%.
was 75% for white children. Now, here's the thing. How and why is it that a child, does not trust the police? More so, when they were doing these surveys, these young Black children were saying that they would not involve the police out of fear that the police would make it worse, or they would be a target of the police. Right? And I think it feeds back into some of these narratives that we have. So here's the thing. People want to talk about crime. They want to talk about violence. They want to talk about gangs. They want to talk about all of these things. But what you're not understanding is, if I can't trust the police to be there when I call them, then communities are going to find a way to police themselves. Right? If I can't trust the police to come when I need help and protection, communities within themselves are going to find ways and means of protection. So when we are talking about gang violence, when we're talking about knife crime, when we're talking about any of these factors, what is not the lens that it is not being viewed through is one of police failure.
Ooh, a thing to ponder.
Right? And the answer is not to over-police the communities.
No.
Because over-policing does not make them feel safer.
Nope.
Right? In fact, it's shown that it's actually counterproductive in the long run. Right? And things like stop and search, or to those in the US that are watching, stop and frisk. The statistics in the UK bear out that people of color are disproportionately searched. Right? But only in about 20% of stops do they find anything illegal. And by that, I don't mean a weapon. I mean, they might find a joint on you. Right? So I'm like, your policies aren't working. Your attitudes aren't working.
Well, can I just step in there for just a second, just to clarify for people who are watching, because I think in some countries they'll go, oh yeah, but you're not supposed to have a joint. Can we just make a point of typical teenage behavior? You will be found to have something illegal like alcohol. It's typical teenage behavior to access alcohol before your adult age. There's nothing unusual about that. Happens across all demographics. Cigarettes. These are harmless. I mean, we wouldn't say that, but you know, these are things that are normal rites of passage, people would say, within their community. There are jokes told about, you know, kids getting together and buying alcohol or buying cigarettes, or, you know, inappropriate age material. So if you have an 18 film but you're 15, these are all things that are called breaking the law. When you do that 20% statistic, when you actually break it down to things that are actually on the illegal spectrum for what would be disproportionate, like a weapon or a drug. The statistic comes even lower. So things that are not common to teenagers and are actually illegal, the statistic comes right down to like 2% of cases. And I think that's really important to say, because these are behaviors that teenagers typically get involved in across the spectrum, but are disproportionately affecting, because once they get that 20%, they are criminalized quicker for doing something that their peers are let go for. Just wanted to point that in. As
I just want to add to that within the UK, there's been a number of white politicians who have confessed to taking drugs. Right. I want to point out that traces of cocaine were found in the restrooms in the Houses of Parliament, right, and other areas in the Houses of Parliament. I don't see police raiding the Houses of Parliament.
Sadly, no.
Right?
Maybe they should.
Oh, they should. They definitely should. But they don't, and they won't. Right? So once again, we need to start talking about the attitudes with which policing is done. And once you start looking at the demographics in which policing is done and on whom heavy-handed policing is done, then we start to see that race plays a massive factor in it. Right? So you're dealing with the inability to trust the police, right? And in part, it's because of the over-policing. It's also because of the attitudes of the police towards people. It's to do with the hiring. It's to do with historical failures. It's to do with the dehumanization. And I think the dehumanization point is an important one, because essentially how the police see communities of color is as though they are the zookeepers and the communities are the animals, right? And I think that's very much displayed in the idea that and I think wider society has a role to play in this as well, actually, and a lot to answer for in this, in that it allows, it enables, and it does not confront police when they build, develop, and maintain a them and us mentality, right? And the police are very rarely held truly to account. And I want to say this: Wayne Couzens, the police officer who murdered Sarah Everard, was known by his colleagues as the rapist. Right? You had the police officer in the UK just the other week admitting to, I've forgotten how many cases of rape. Right? But even his colleagues had nicknames for him and thought he was weird and strange and all the rest of it. Right? So these behaviors are known. But because of this them and us mentality that is fostered, the criminals within the police force are protected. Right? But the innocent members of communities of color are not. Right? Because the statistics, as we said, show that in 80%, nothing is found.
Right.
In 98%, nothing that could cause harm to another person is found. Right? But you've criminalized the whole community through the over policing. And one of the things that we need to think of is actually the psychological harm that this does to a community. Because if you over police a community, then you, in essence, pathologize that community.
Mm-hmm.
You're telling that community that they can't be trusted, that they are criminal, that they require constant monitoring. That kind of sounds like a plantation,
Kind of does. Sadly, it kind of does.
right? Um, you mentioned the adultification
Mm-hmm.
of children,
Mm-hmm.
and you mentioned it in regards to black boys and girls. And I want to focus on the adultification of black girls
Mm-hmm.
because I think it ties into one show we did a while back, the Child Q case,
Yeah.
right? Um, Disproportionately, the number of children that are strip searched by the police are those of color, right? When I spoke of the lack of trust, the statistics of the lack of trust um, that black children and youth have in the police, the demographic with the lowest levels of trust in the police were black girls. And so you need to ask yourself, what is it that black girls and young black women know about the police
Mm-hmm.
that they would trust them less than a black man who knows he could easily be killed by them?
They can kill girls in ways that don't require bullets.
Right? So here's the thing. Well, why would I trust you less? Well, if I, as a young girl, am being strip searched, and that is justified
Mm-hmm.
by all the authorities around me,
Mm-hmm.
why am I going to trust you? We've seen the fact that police, and this is what we publicly know, and
Mm.
look, this is me saying this as a guy, because as I said, I don't know what black girls know about the police that would make them trust them less than I do.
I can
And
give you the
my
anecdotal evidence.
my trust of the police, listen, is non-existent. You would have to go far, or I thought you'd have to go far to find somebody who trusted the police less than I do. Apparently, I just need to call up any black woman in my phone, right? Anyway, I've gone off on a
Particularly
tangent.
if they are from a poor neighborhood or background or have worked in those areas. And I think that, anyway, you finish your point. I can give you the anecdotal stories, but you finish your point. I can tell you why. But
Listen, I'm sure you could, but what I'm saying is that we've seen the fact that they've been strip searched from a young age,
Mhm,
right? 12, 13, you're strip searching
mhm,
girls. We know that they're full of rapists. The police force is full of rapists and sexual predators, right?
mhm.
The amount that have come out in the past 6 months, right? You've had
Staggering.
whistleblowers talking about You've had whistleblowers talking about the fact that there's many incidents that are covered up, right? So we know sexual predators are rampant within the police. Well, who's the easiest demographic for you to target,
Black girls,
right?
less likely to be believed, less
Within the
likely
U.S.,
to be.
I don't know if you remember the case in the U.S. a few years ago with the police officer Daniel Holdsclaw,
I remember the
where
name.
he specifically targeted
That's
black
it.
women
Mhm.
because he knew they wouldn't be believed, right? He was charged with 80 something counts or 100 and something count of rape, and it's likely to be a lot higher, right? So what does that then do to black women, right? And that's and I think what you're seeing there is, as I said, it's a combination of the adultification and the dehumanization of black women. And I think it all stems back to the fact that for centuries, white people have been able to have their way with the bodies of young black women, right?
Girls, young black girls.
Yes, girls and women.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reality is there's been a segment of people that have never gotten over that, right? And it's funny that, once again, we're talking about this sort of attitude of the dehumanization, the adultification, the ownership of black bodies.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, that the social research is saying actually police officers hold higher racial biases and xenophobic tendencies than members of the general public. It would say to me that these police officers are white supremacists actively going into these fields,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I think
So
that's a fair conclusion.
yeah, I look, anyway, look, you say what you got to say. You said you have anecdotal stories. Look, you know, me and the police, we ain't friends. I've got my own history and stories with the popo.
Well, I think it's to add to the point of the adultification of black girls. I am what is termed in modern context as passing. In terms of the color of my skin doesn't match the DNA and the people that I come from. So people would consider me of passing origin. But I grew up in a poor neighborhood with black and brown people everywhere. And the majority of people I rolled with, of course, were friends and family, and they were all black. And so if I talked about the anecdotal evidence of how I saw my darker skinned friends treated, being catcalled by police officers, cornered by police officers, manhandled by police officers, and no one is going to say anything because the police officer holds the power, and they do it publicly. They do it on the street. They put you in cars. I've had friends who were traumatized, and you know, in those points when you are the one with the passing privilege, so to speak, you're the mouth almighty trying to get your friend out of that situation, your cousin out of that situation, what have you. You know that you're as precariously in danger because of your gender as she is, but you're trying to use every ounce of leverage that you have to free them. So I know a lot of girls who were completely scarred, 14 years old. We would go out, hang out as girls do, or we'd be walking home after school. You'd get cornered by a police officer. We traveled on buses, and police officers would do, I don't know if you remember the raids that they used to do on the buses to get the kids to behave or to check tickets. And they would call, you know, as young black women, you would travel in groups, because if you didn't, they would corner you on the back of a bus. They would start to harass you. You would be sexually assaulted, and no one would say anything, you know. And people now would say, oh, you know, if I look back on those times thinking of friends, my heart breaks, because I don't even realize how scarring that was for all of us. You know, seeing your friend's breast be groped by some police officer who decided that they could do that, you know, you've blocked those images out, but the trust is not there. And this week I shared with you a story of somebody who was harassing me. I was on my way home, young black guy started harassing me, just as some people don't know how to say no, and they do. And I said to you, I hid in a telephone box, and I had to make decisions about my safety that no child should have to make. I don't want him to be arrested because he's going to end up in trouble. He's a black boy. I also don't want the police to come because I would then have to go with a police officer who's not safe, and I don't know that I'm getting home. And how do I negotiate enough of a threat that I can get rid of this boy who's threatening me, and I can get rid of this police officer who I need to use in order to keep me safe? And I don't want you to come and find me. So how, and you're cowering as a child, making decisions that no adult should have to make. And I think that when we talk about the adultification of black children, what I experienced as a passing, and I say that in quotations, person, is a drop in the ocean to what my black female friends experienced as children. You know, in the inner city area that we grew up in, where policing, the statistics for stop and search were unbelievable. I mean, it's just shocking, the number of people that got stopped and searched. But that generally, statistics wise, was reported as it pertains to black men. The girls are underreported as being stopped and searched because they're not stopping and searching you. They're stopping and deliberately harassing you so you don't get written up as a statistic. And so you don't even get, well, we stopped this number of girls, because they're not reporting that. They're not saying what they're doing. And so, yes, the boy statistics are known, but if you had to actually go and raid the police and work out how many girls they were harassing, it's unknown. It's an unquantifiable, because they're not registering those stuff. They're stopping the girls they want to harass, who are very young. And I've had friends, we were walking on a very famous street in our area, and we were like, school uniform, you know, you have your badge on, you're wearing your school uniform badge. We are children, school uniform, and we're screaming at the top of our lungs, we're children. At who are you screaming that at? We're screaming it at a police officer, with the whole neighborhood watching what's happening, and everyone is powerless to do anything other than stand and bear witness to what's happening to a child. But what happens after that is no one is coming up to you afterwards and being like, we're really sorry, that shouldn't happen to you. Shall we get you some help? Do you want to talk to a counsellor? Should we refer you to your GP? Do you need us to help you figure out how you're going to get home safely? You shouldn't walk alone. None of that's happening. And so when you say that black women, particularly darker women, are subjected to the brutality of police, with none of the protections, with no one supporting, with none of the community behind them, yeah, I'm not surprised that the statistics turns around and says, oh, but black women trust the police even less, because black women are having to constantly make a decision, constantly from a very young age. How am I going to stay physically safe while negotiating whatever terrible situation I happen to find myself in? And the police are not a safe option. I was told as a rite of passage, you don't go nowhere with a police officer. Punt. What are you supposed to do? Never an explanation of what you're supposed to do. And all my friends got the same talk. That talk. What are you going to do?
Hail a bus.
Stops you, you do not get into the car. What's happening to our mothers and aunties and grandmothers, and what happened to them that was the rite of passage, that every girl I went to school with who was black had that talk? That's a generational trauma that's being handed down generation after generation after generation, and is being lived out as a reality of every black girl that was walking those streets that I grew up in. It's insane. So no, I'm not surprised that black women trust the police less than you.
Okay. Okay. Well, as I said, if you trust the police less than me, then listen, the things you must want to do to police. Anyway, so I don't know if you know this, but well, the first part you'll know that the UK is fast seeking to be the little brother to the US in all things. So they are introducing police officers into schools in the UK, and some schools already have them. And there's talk
Massive
about
campaign to have.
expanding the system,
Yep.
right?
Campaign all round to have
Well,
them removed.
right. So I don't know if you know, but as of last month, there was an agreement with Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, and the Met Police that what's going to happen is that the Met officers in schools are to be monitored to see if they are disproportionately targeting Black children. I'm sorry, we don't need you to monitor them for us to tell you this.
Please just
Everybody
remove
knows
them from
this.
schools.
We don't need the monitoring.
Well,
We can tell you. Just
you know what's really
look,
disgusting about that? There are neighborhoods in which majority of the students will be Black. How are you monitoring that? I'm sorry. Is that coming up in your statistics? Are they disproportionately affecting the Black children? The whole school is Black. So are you going to be able to count that statistic? When they view the entire school as inferior, when they have an adultification view of the 12-year-olds they're standing over, treating them like they're 16, how are you going to test that? In what means well tested? Well, they never stopped any white children, so they must be disproportionately affecting Black people. There were no white children in that school to begin with. What are you talking about? Remove the police from schools, please. Please, just remove them.
well, what I think is interesting is actually Khan is pushing to have the law changed so that it is mandatory in cases where police use force that there is community oversight.
What does that look like? I don't even trust what you said. That's really bad, isn't it? I don't even trust him. I'm sorry, but what? You said police are involved. I'm like,
Basically, where police use force, there will
mm.
be a community panel that will have an overview of that case to decide or to say whether actually it was justified or not. Now,
Where's this community coming from?
well, that's a question. In theory, it's a good idea. The problem is who's picking the panel.
Like I said, in whose community are we taking this?
Right?
What is the criteria that we're taking this?
Right. So, as I said, in theory, it could be a good adjustment to the law, but I need to have some more details on that. Now, the troubling thing is,
And
we
is that
covered a
supposed
while
to
back.
act as a deterrent? What is that supposed to act as? If
Yeah,
there's
it's
been an
supposed.
incident, when there's been an incident, we'll do this. When X does this, we'll do this.
Mm-hmm.
Shall we figure out why X is doing it in the first place so we stop that at its root so we don't have to employ this tactic?
I think that will be a good way to go. But if we can stop police officers acting with impunity, if
Okay.
there's
Yes.
consequences for their actions, then maybe it will force some change. And then you can start to implement better procedures for hiring, vetting, discipline, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. But we spoke a while ago, or we mentioned it, that we got rid of Dick by name and Dick by nature as Met commissioner,
Wow.
right? The new one that they've put in is, look,
Worse?
different day,
Worse,
same excrement. Yeah, that's
worse
all I
than
can
her
say.
predecessor.
So, for we've touched on this in the show. Years ago, there was a public inquiry into the Metropolitan Police in which they're found to be institutionally racist, right? The problem is that Dick, what she said was that she actually didn't recognize that
Report.
no, Dick said that the findings of the Met McPherson report no longer applied to the Met Police.
I remember
Despite all the metrics saying
being
actually
exactly
it's
the
still
same, if
low,
not worse.
right? What we have now is a Met commissioner who is saying that he does not accept this description of the Met Police. So you've had a public inquiry into the Metropolitan Police, right? And the past two commissioners basically have not accepted the findings of the inquiry. So how do you expect things to change, right?
Oh, it's exhausting.
And I think one of the things that the new commissioner Crowley, when he came in, he was grilled on some of this, and he said, look, the Metropolitan Police has clearly failed the Black communities, and change needs to be made. I'm sorry, but how can you say you failed Black communities? Because that would imply there's a systematic
Failure.
problem, because you're not failing one community. It's not just
Multiple
one Black
communities.
community. You're
Yes.
dotted all over London, and as a whole, you have failed them, right? But then go and say, well, actually, I don't accept this description of the Metropolitan Police as being institutionally racist. We failed Black communities time and time again, but no, we're not racist. I asked this question at the onset of the show. Make that make sense?
I think we're running over time, but I really want people to really think about their personal interactions in some way and to assess how they view Black children. How are you viewing, when don't justify it, don't immediately go to, oh well, but he was doing, or oh well, but they are so much taller, whatever excuse you want to give to, because those automatic moments are indications that there is a fundamental problem. If you see a Black child, because we were talking about the adultification of Black children in the show, if you see a Black child and they do something that you deem you're unhappy with, how do you actually react? What is your actual reaction to that? And really assess, is this because if the color of their sins simply changed and I saw a child of the different origins doing exactly the same behavior, what would I think? Oh, children are being children. Oh, they're silly. Why are you not able to apply that to Black children? Is it the over policing? Is it the adultification? Is it the dehumanization? What was the other one you gave? There was another list. You really have to go through and say, what is my perception of childhood that I can treat children in this way? And how is it that we're not holding these systems accountable to actually change? I mean, this is unbelievable. Some of the stuff. Anyway, being mindful of time.
Yeah, look, all of these issues that we've spoken of, I have real intimate personal experience with. Going from school, teachers, police. Look, listen, I'm happy to burn it all to the ground. Right? Burn it all to the ground, start again. It's not fit for purpose. And people can talk about reform. Listen, these institutions have been being reformed for decades, if not centuries, and we're still facing the same problems. If you had a car that was giving you the same problem every few months, at some point you would be, okay, it's time to just bin it and buy a new one. It's time to bin the police and build a new one.
Yeah, I can't even argue with you. I think that what I hope that our viewers take away from this as a piece of discussion thought for themselves is that when we talk about the over policing of Black children, we're talking about services that go beyond just policing. If a child isn't safe, to raise concerns about their health to safe adults, because those adults will put their lives in jeopardy or separate them from their family or do things that are exclude them from school. If there are no safe spaces for children to turn to when they are in need, if a child goes into what should be a safe space, like a school or a GP or a sports club or whatever, and they should be safe in those environments, but those who have power and authority are punitive and act like the police and are over heavy-handed with their discipline and treat the child as if the child is an adult, give harsher consequences to the child than their white peers, we have a total problem in the system. It's not just one area. And I think in some ways, I think this is a conversation which I hope people realize goes beyond looking at police, but moves through the whole system of a child's life and says, if that's the experience that a child has of the world growing up, if their experience of the world is that there aren't safe adults, that there is nowhere they are safe to express themselves or to learn or to grow or to have those experiences, because in each of those spaces they are not judged as a child, they're not viewed as a child, they're not treated with the same love and care as other children, and therefore their experience of the world is that they're having to make really tough choices from a young age to moderate their language, their behavior, to appease a system, from school to GP to mental health facilities to all of those spaces, including the police. What does that do to the adult who survives that childhood? What type of trauma has that child lived with that is going to shape their outcomes later on, shape the way that they move through worlds? And I think that we have to start looking at this in some serious ways.
Just an aside, I think one of the things to bear in mind, or something I want people to consider, is that the adultification of Black children becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and cycle. And by that, I mean those in positions in authority, they overage the body of Black. They're bigger, they're stronger, they're more physically developed. But as a result, the consequences of that is that that child is forced to have to think like an adult before they are actually prepared and equipped to think like an adult. They don't have the freedom to make the mistakes that their white peers and counterparts have, right? And so what does that do to the maturing and the maturity process, right? If a Black child now has to make adult decisions, and by that, so I'll speak from my own experience. I've always been big, right? Since I was a kid, I've always been bigger than my peers. I've always towered over white teachers and Black teachers and male teachers and female teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And where I would see my white peers get angry with teachers, and shout at them and raise their voices. I always had to moderate my behaviors
Mm-hmm.
because I would quickly be seen as a threat,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I remember once there was an incident with the teacher, and the teacher, she spoke to my mother and she said, I became very threatening and hostile towards her, right? And this was at a point where she had just pissed me off. And I was like, I'm done. I'm not moderating my body language or anything like that. So, what she took as threatening was I stood up straight because, in order to not be a threat, I have to step back and I have to slouch and I have to try to make myself smaller. And the problem is, in doing that, people often think they can take liberties with you. And I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. So I stood up straight. And because she had pissed me off, my whole response was, now you're going to be pissed off. Right. And I have a way of irritating people when I want to, and speaking to people in a way when I want to irritate you. Right. It will be very monotonous and very slow, very deliberate, very monotonous, very slow. And I said to my mom, I just wanted to irritate her. And my mom immediately knew what I had done. And she told a woman about herself and bounced. And she's like, you better not go to no detention. Right. But that is the reality, that as a 12-year-old, I'm having to make these decisions every day in every interaction. These are adult decisions that I'm having to make.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, here's the thing. You speak to women that have become single mothers, regardless of race, at a young age. And they tell you that, hey, once that child grows up and they have freedom, all the freedoms they missed out on as a teenager, they go to make up for. Right? Here's the thing. At which point do Black children get to make up for all the freedoms that they ever missed out on as children?
Never.
For all the adult decisions that they've had to make.
Never.
Right? And so I would say, if there's a feeling of loss for people that have become single mothers and forced to grow up before they were ready, before it was time for them, right? If there's that feeling of loss of freedom, of youth, of all of these things, that they want to go back and revisit it, what is the impact that is being had on Black adults now who never have that opportunity to go back and revisit?
Get stuck in a cycle of helplessness. Mental health certainly suffers.
And I think that's the thing. You're seeing it played out. You are seeing it played out. And so where you talk about breakdowns of the family units, where you talk about breakdowns of relationships, you're talking about breakdowns of society, of midlife crisis, of all of these things. How much of it can actually be traced back to the concept or the idea that there was a lot that has been missed out on? And at some point, something has to give, something has to break.
Yeah. Well, I think that we have given our viewers a lot to think about. I hope if you've been prompted to think about this, if this show has helped you to think about the adultification, over policing of Black children in a different way, or to think about it for the first time, please do let us know. We love to engage in your feedback, etc. Please do share this with your friends if you think it will be helpful. I am reminded that this month is Black History Month in the US. We are a European-based group, so we tend to focus our attention this way, but blessings to those that are enjoying their Black History Month in the US. I hope that you are being educated in more than just Black history, but also in African history and beyond, so that you can get a holistic sense of the people. But I think that for today, it is with a heavy heart that we sign out, because this topic isn't easy and it touches both of our lives very closely. And we've both had experiences that would otherwise, life outcomes would be different. Let's put it like that. So knowing the subject as intimately as we know it, and as heavily as we know it, we sign off today wishing you all the best this February, and seeing you next week, when I can't remember what our topic is, but I will post it tomorrow. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Storm, for doing the dark side today. Always a pleasure, even if it's a difficult topic. Peace out.
Yeah, all of that.
Like, share, subscribe. You know what to do. All right. Goodbye.